Okay, great. All right, so let's start as usual with the some breathing meditation followed by generating the right motivation. So let's start. Now, in the space in front of you, visualize Buddha Shakyamuni, who rises in the form of a fully ordained monk and who's inseparable from your personal Lama. And the Buddha is surrounded by all great masters of the different traditions. And again, all these masters like Nagarjuna and so forth, they're of one nature with your personal Lama. And they're all appearing in order to inspire us, to serve as an example. They're all appearing in the space in front of us. And then think that we're surrounded by all sentient beings who, although rising in different forms, with different bodies, are all the same in wanting to be free from suffering, wanting to experience happiness, satisfaction. And despite their current confusion, aversion, and other afflictions, the basic nature of their mind is the same as that of the Buddha. The same as our own mind. And so they all have the potential to become fully enlightened. And so let's first generate a feeling of affection for those endless sentient beings. A feeling of acceptance. Of their temporary shortcomings. And a feeling of closeness. Also described as affectionate love. And then from within this affection for all sentient beings, we generate great compassion, a way of thinking. May all these sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. To generate the strong aspiration, the wish. May they be free from all obscurations. And may I be able to free them from their suffering and the causes of their suffering. And that great compassion then becomes the special altruistic attitude. And that we generate the determination, I will do whatever I can to help sentient beings to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. And since we can only bring this about realistically if we first become enlightened ourselves, let's generate the mind of enlightenment, the aspiration or determination to become enlightened, in order to be able to lead sentient beings to a state that is free from suffering and the causes of suffering. And it's also with this motivation that we study Chandrakirti's text and recite the prayers together. I take refuge until I'm enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the positive accumulation I gather by listening to the Dharma, may I attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I'm enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the positive accumulation I gather by listening to the Dharma, may I attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I'm enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the positive accumulation I gather by listening to the Dharma, may I attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. Then the four measurables. Yes. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings never be separated from happiness that is free from suffering. And may all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. And then the 7 prayers directed at the visualization of the Buddha and the other masters in the space in front of us. Yeah, if you scroll it up a little bit, there it is. Thank you. Reverently I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind. I present every type of offering, actual and imagined. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginningless time. And rejoice in the merit of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain until the end of cyclic existence. And turn the wheel of Dharma for living beings. I dedicate my own merits and those of others to the great enlightenment. All right. And so for this coming week, well, of course, the most important state of mind you should again and again, no matter how difficult it is, how hard at times it may be to generate it, it should be the mind of enlightenment. To just again and again, when things get tough, just remind yourself that's all right. I'm doing this for the welfare of all sentient beings. When there's a problem, when you're happy, when things go well, every now and then bring that back to mind. In particular, when things are tough, because that's usually when we forget the Dharma, but to also remind ourselves, well, depending on where you're at times when things are tough, you do remember the Dharma and you take refuge. But in any case, whether you feel well, you don't feel well, or you feel neutral, to bring that back over and over again. But then, of course, as we also discussed last time, for this week, the emphasis should also be on your Lama. If you haven't found a person who you call your, well, to use the Tibetan word translated into English, like your root Lama, your main Lama, well, don't worry about it. It'll sooner or later you'll find that person. It should be a fully qualified Lama in the form of someone like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, or Jada Rinpoche has got a special connection to Israel. Well, the late Dhammalucha Rinpoche, even although he's passed on, well, there's a connection there. And of course, he continues to exist, just in a different form. Of course, Lama Zopa Rinpoche and His Holiness the Karmapa, of course, of a different tradition. All the great lamas that we're familiar with, there we know for sure that they're fully qualified, that they're, in terms of their standing, possibly in terms of conventional status, that may differ, but in terms of their qualities, we should think of them as differently, especially if we see more than one Lama as a Pasna Lama. Well, then we just see them as inseparable. And of course, very important to regard them as inseparable from all other Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. In that way, through this person, who we have maybe never met, doesn't matter, but whose teachings speak to us in a certain way. They speak to us more than someone else's teachings. That already shows you've got a connection with that particular person. And of course, they should be qualified in the way mentioned. And take your time to, of course, check, is this the kind of person I would like to regard as my Lama? And in the meantime, there's no harm in making a connection, listening to their teachings, trying to put them into practice, but also not to rush into it. And of course, if you have already made that connection, we feel close to a Lama, to really put into practice what they've taught us. But to, for instance, if we do this practice of the 7 limb prayer, well, that encompasses, it contains everything that is needed in terms of connecting to our teacher. It's said to be extremely powerful in terms of accumulating a lot of merit, kind of bowing or opening ourselves. It's much less of a physical action of bowing down or prostrating ourselves, but more an opening ourselves with body, speech, and mind to what they've got to teach us, to make offerings, even visualized. So I remember years ago, many, many years ago, His Holiness gave a Kala Chakra initiation in Sikkim. And I went there with some friends. That was before I studied Tibetan. I was just a new nun. And we met this incredible practitioner, this nun who was such an amazing practitioner. And she was so devoted to her teachers, especially His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And we had some tea with her. And she said she's so inspired by His Holiness that wherever she goes, whatever beautiful she sees, she offers to His Holiness. And she says the mandala prayer, the short mandala offering. But I guess that's not even necessary. So whenever she sees something beautiful, she offers it to His Holiness. So whenever she's in a car, she sees a beautiful tree or whatever, flowers or a beautiful, I don't know, a store window, whatever it is, she offers it. So that's a beautiful way. Of course, if you can make your own offering, maybe put some flowers somewhere and see that as an offering, but you can just offer it about anything. Best offering is of body, speech, and mind, in that I dedicate myself to the Dharma in body, mind, and body, speech, and mind. Of course, that is the best practice of making an offering, but you could just, anything beautiful you see, just offer it to your Lama. It's a very effective practice, and you can just walk around in nature, in town, wherever. And I thought it was so inspiring. And I try to do it whenever I remember, to kind of do that kind of practice with prayer or without prayer. It doesn't matter. So that's one thing to do. But of course, to communicate and take refuge in that person, taking refuge again, just seeing them for the Dharma that they live, being an embodiment of the Dharma, of course. And that's so important because they live the Dharma. They show us how it is possible to live the Dharma. That's what we're attempting to do, to bring it into our own life, to apply it to every situation. But what's so special about the Lamas, who there are quite a few around, and some of them are more known and some of them are less known. But anyway, so having different, and we can have more than one Lama. There's not like a limit to how many Lamas you can take as your personal Lama, but don't see them as separate as such. Plus practice what they teach and regard them as an embodiment of the teaching. So to show us how to do it, that's really what they basically do. And it comes along with this joyful feeling of faith and devotion. So those are very beneficial states of mind that calm our mind, that help us against fear and worry. So when things go bad, when things are really difficult, you can always think back of your Lama. So just the other day, I watched some documentary about this airplane crash. And I was thinking, if I was in that crash, if I was just, I take airplanes traveling. And so I was thinking, what would I do in that situation? I thought, well, I'll just think, I've got His Holiness. His Holiness is there. I'm okay. Whatever there is, I'm going to die. I'm going to maybe burn to death. Well, it's hopefully quick, but I've got His Holiness. I'm okay. So that was that thought of just, I'm all right. Everything else that happens, that's just superficial. What's really counts are these great beings like His Holiness the Dalai Lama and our other great Lamas. So just knowing that they exist, looking at or getting to know their teachings, attending their teachings, and even if we don't meet them, we connect to them mentally, and it helps us to go beyond what we have now. So really important, that feeling of devotion and faith and just joy. It's a type of faith. There are different types of faith, but one of the types of faith I'm talking about here, this kind of devotional, it's a joyful state of mind and extremely healthy, extremely beneficial. But it's not easy to do, to rely on a teacher. We have this tendency to see faults in everyone. We usually project our own faults onto another person. But we may even, of course, follow a person who may have certain faults, and that's difficult if we've relied on such a person. But that doesn't mean we need to just cut that relationship. We need to speak out if we see something that is not in accordance with the Dharma, but also focus on what we've learned and what they've taught us. Now, I don't want to say too much about it. It's a whole subject matter that's too extensive. I can only recommend, please do the reading, especially in the Lamrim Chemo, that is in the Treatise of the Stages of the Path to Enlightenment, the extensive one that have been translated by Lama Tsongkhapa. If you've got the time, also read Sopa Geshe Sopa's commentary, Steps to Enlightenment, I think it's called, the first volume. And there you find beautiful explanations how to go about it. And as I said last time, well, see what you can take on, how much you can practice this, and be aware, although it's at the beginning of the Lamrim, it's one of the most difficult things to practice, most difficult topics to practice, to keep going with this. And initially, I mean, it gets easier with like anything you do, but initially to kind of practice it that way, but it's necessary. It's absolutely necessary. It's the root of the path, as it says in many prayers and many texts. And without it, the Dharma becomes too dry. So to see it come alive in these beings, in these great beings, helps us to practice in that way. They serve as a refuge, some place we can rely on, and even just mentally communicating when we have a problem. We definitely connect even on that mental basis. All right. So since we have a lot to go through, I want to leave it at that. But please make a point this week, besides your practice of course, compassion, bodhicitta, also try to bring that into your own life. And if you can, to also regard your Lama as being of one nature with your other lamas, plus of one nature with all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, to get the full benefit, not just of your own Lama, but also the full benefit of other Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Because if you see them as inseparable, you automatically connect with them, although they're not literally one person. That's not what this means. But in terms of their qualities, inseparable in that sense, and you connect indirectly through your Lama with other Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And so that is extremely effective. All right, so very large topic, but really highly effective. The topic on, relying on your Lama, on your spiritual teacher. Okay, great. But that should suffice for today on that topic. So for what to do this week, and of course, working towards the weekend when Jadi Rinpoche gives a teaching, you're well prepared in terms of the mind of enlightenment, and of course, devoting yourself to your Lama, if Jadi Rinpoche is one of your Lamas, and maybe becomes your Lama as a result of his teachings. But then to come back to the topic, of course, entry into the middle way. Now we've come to the Chittamatra school, the mind-only school, as part of still Chandrakirti discussing the fact that phenomena, although they're generated, they're not generated from themselves, and they're not generated from a cause that's inherently separate, inherently different from the effect. Even being, generated by a cause, that cause is not inherently different. Now we got to verse, I need to look at my own notes, it was 39. We went through that. We started with the Chittamatra school. And in particular, there's like this transition, if you like, in the sense of, all right, so how do we come to the Chittamatra school? How do we get from analyzing how phenomena are generated? How do they arise from a cause? How do we get to talk now about the Chittamatra school? Well, in the sense that if we say phenomena do not exist inherently, do not exist in and of themselves, and at the same time we talk about cause and effect, especially cause and effect that is active over a long period of time, that's difficult. It's difficult for us if we're so used to inherent existence. There's a sense, how could that work? And someone actually asked this question, what happens if there's a certain emotion that I had, like, let's say 30 years ago. 30 years ago, I had this emotion in my life, and without any obvious kind of trigger, suddenly this emotion is back. This person talking about, yeah, well, we talk about the brain being like a storage of our memory, etc. But if there's nothing inherently there, no inherently existent causes and conditions, how come this emotion suddenly arises? Now, that is similar after 30 years, or let's say you accumulate in one life, you accumulate a certain action, you engage in a certain action and a virtuous action, and then that action ceases a moment later, you stop doing that action, and then a life later, maybe in this lifetime, but even also a lifetime later, you experience the result of that. Well, how's that at all possible? And so in answer to that, well, in the Chittamatra school, they would say, well, you need a basis that's really stable, because we talk about what are called imprints. Something is left on the mind, and something is left by that action, and you need a very stable basis that holds all these imprints. And that is a view that is shared mainly by a school called the Chittamatra school. Now, if you're interested in those 4 schools, maybe a way to remember a little bit, remember these 4 schools, maybe the following explanation. I may have given that to you before, not sure. I can sometimes get confused about the classes I taught this in, but to say this much, there are these 4 schools, and we're following the highest school, the Madhyamika school, which can be subdivided into Svatantrika and Prasangika. But let's start with the school that is here considered to be the lowest school. So lowest only in the sense that it's not like kind of putting them down or kind of to denigrate them or in any way belittle them. No, it's more about saying that in terms of their explanation of reality, of how things really exist, their explanation is the furthest from the Prasangika school. But it helps us to study their views in order to, well, get closer to the highest view. So it's a bit like when you exercise, you need to start slowly. If you want to stretch, well, if you want to eventually, I don't know, put your feet behind your neck or something bizarre that could help you with your back pain or what have you, well, we're trying to stretch our mind to the extent we try to understand how phenomena do not exist inherently. So this is quite a feat that's really difficult. We really have to stretch our mind to a certain degree that is initially difficult. So we stretch it only that far. We first studied the Vaibhashika and the Satantrika schools, in particular Satantrika. So what did they tell us? Although they say that nothing can exist without a mind. So someone asked this question. Someone said, well, from last Sunday, they take this to mean that all the Buddhist schools, or most Buddhist schools, say phenomena can only exist if there's a mind. And what is the source of that, saying that? Well, the source is, in the case of the Vaibhashika and the Satantrika school, Vaibhashika, for instance, well, really the main source is a text called Vabhivasha Shastra, or Abhidharma Mahabhivasha Shastra, I think it's called in Sanskrit, or the Abhidharma treatise on the great particularities. can translate it that way. That is a Vaibhashika root text that is said to have been composed by 800 arhats on the basis of the teachings on Abhidharma the Buddha gave. But that doesn't exist in Tibetan, so instead we have the Abhidharma Kosha by Vasubandhu, a text called Abhidharma Kosha by Vasubandhu, in which Vasubandhu describes the Vaibhashika system. And in there it becomes clear, well, phenomena's existence is described in dependence on the mind. The Satantrika are even clearer. The source for the Satantrika teachings, of course, are the sutras, the sutras, also the first turning of the wheel of the Dharma, for instance, but of the texts that we have in Tibetan, that usually are used in Tibetan, is the Pramanavartika, or the Compendium of Logic, the Companion of Valid Cognition by Dharmakirti, and its root text, the Compendium of Logic by Dignaga. That is mainly set forth, well, there are certain parts of it that are set forth from the point of view of the Satantrika, and we have definitions. What does it mean to be existent? Well, it means to be observed by the mind. What does it mean to be an object of knowledge, which is saying existent? So existent and object of knowledge are synonymous, are equivalent. And what is the definition of that? That which is suitable to be to appear to consciousness, or you have established base, or object of comprehension. Object of comprehension, again, it's the same as existent. Whatever exists is an object of comprehension. What is the definition of object of comprehension? That was just realized by valid cognition. So it all comes down to being realized by a valid cognizer, by valid cognition, in other words, by the mind. So those are the definitions. They do talk about whatever exists. Well, it exists because there's a mind to perceive it. But although they give these definitions, so in particular here, the Satantrika school, those are their definitions. And you find that, for instance, in texts such as Collected Topics, the definitions are all cited in there. And their root text is the Abhidharma Kosha, or the Pramanavartika, that is the compendium of valid cognition. Now, although they say that, but they still they kind of hold that view. But on the other hand, if you check, well, if they're meant to train our mind to become more familiar with reality, they deal with the I, they deal with the self. How does the self exist? They don't deal with phenomena other than the self. So in other words, they say phenomena, external phenomena exist truly. The way they appear to us, they actually exist. So they do not talk about emptiness or some mode of existence, although they say, yes, well, they depend on the mind, but there's no explanation of some ultimate mode of existence when it comes to phenomena other than the I. They only talk about selflessness. Now, the Chittamatra school, the next kind of school, and again, they are very much just on the mind. So what do they say? They take these external objects made of atoms, and they search for something there. Like look at a phenomenon such as a table, a car, whatever, all these objects of our senses around us, and understanding, even at that time, and Holness talks about quantum physics having existed already 2,000-3,000 years ago in India. Well, yeah, because there was an understanding that those objects around us must be made of basic building blocks. So they talked about small particles being made of, well, atoms, if you want to call them atoms. They had no real understanding of what an atom looks like in the same way as physicists, but they did accept that. Now, in the Vaibhashika and the Satantrika, they even believed, definitely the Vaibhashika, they would say they're partness particles, they're these smallest building blocks. It can no further divide, and there's just this external world, the way it exists, the way it appears to us. The Chittamatra would say, well, actually, if we take it apart, if we take apart these particles, there is nothing small as we can endlessly, divide them up. That actually means they can't exist. So that was their conclusion. They said, we can't find anything. If we really divide them up, there's nothing to be found. So in conclusion to that, they didn't say, oh, phenomena don't exist inherently. No way. They'd say, oh, so they can't exist externally. So phenomena don't exist externally, which would mean there's only mind. And that was their assertion. That was the assertion of the Chittamatra school. They said there are truly existent phenomena, but no truly existent external phenomena. They exist truly. What is it that exists? Well, the mind exists truly, for sure. And then all these objects that appear to the mind, the sense objects, they're just appearances to the mind. Very interesting idea. So it's based on not being able to find something when you take these subtle atoms. However, instead of concluding, as I just said, they don't exist inherently, they say, oh, they don't exist externally. There's no external existence. There's really just mind. All right. And in terms of, their assertion that you can't have anything without mind, that's pretty obvious. And you find that in the sutra, for instance, Unraveling the Thought, which is part of the third wheel of Dharma. And of course, there are a lot of other sources for that assertion. Now, then, having come to the Chittamatra school, well, there are those following reasoning, and there are those following, Chittamatrans following scripture. And in particular, those following reasoning, they don't talk about a foundational consciousness or fundamental kind of mind basis of all, as it's mentioned here. It's only the ones following scripture that use those. All right. Now, of course, then when you move on to the highest school, the Madhyamika, there they say, well, the Svatantrika, you have the Svatantrika Madhyamika and the Prasangika Madhyamika. And then the Svatantrika, there are those that are kind of a little similar to the mind-only school. And then there's the other one that's not similar to the mind-only school. But just to keep it simple, the Svatantrika basically says, well, this importance that the mind-only school gives to the mind, we don't give it in that same way. So they kind of distinguish, and they basically say, well, nothing exists truly. So whether external or not eternal, even external or not external, even the mind itself doesn't exist truly. It just exists inherently. That's basically what the Svatantrika says. And then the Prasangika school says nothing exists inherently, nor truly. There's no difference between the two. Now, having said this, for some of you, this may still be confusing, but let's just focus on the Chittamatra, who claim that there is the Chittamatra following scripture. And actually, there are some quotations from Ketubje, for instance, one of the disciples of Lama Tsongkhapas, who says that there are actually also some followers of the Svatantrika school, especially those kind of leaning towards the Chittamatra school, that say this kind of foundational consciousness exists. Now let's look at this, because you may wonder, why? I'm so confused already as it is. I've got enough wrong views. Why should I add another one from some Chittamatra person that I'm not interested in? But what we need to understand that these ideas, they're a little bit like when you say, for instance, training wheels. When you when you learn to ride a bicycle, first, I guess most kids, nowadays they have bicycles where you just push with your feet and you don't have to kind of use them the way like an adult person uses them. You just use your feet. But you have only, like when I grew up, I had this bicycle with training wheels at the side. So instead of just having 2 wheels in the center, I had 4 wheels. And those training wheels, they're just temporary, but they help me to then learn to keep my balance, to move my feet in the proper way without falling over. And then at some point, my balance I reached this point where I could remove these training wheels and I could ride the bicycle. So that's similar. Or these floaters that you use when you learn to swim. Like a yoke, when you use a yoke in order to be able to swim, to learn how to swim, you need it temporarily to be able to learn the movements, become more flexible. Your body gets used to this movement of swimming. And then when you're confident enough, the yoke, for instance, can be removed. This ring thing kind of can be removed. Or if you use these floater devices, whatever they're called. So anyway, you no longer need them. And so the purpose is really to become ready physically to do a movement that initially was difficult. Now here it's very similar. these ideas we study that are not the final ideas, they're like these training wheels. They're like these, yokes or what have you that we put around us just temporarily, like crutches, if you like crutches that when you can't walk properly, you need them to give you some support. And when you're ready, when you've healed or whatever was the problem, well, you're able to leave them behind. In that way, they support us. They help us to gain a better understanding of ideas that are really difficult, and that are especially difficult when you talk about the high school. Well, hearing about phenomena don't exist inherently. So we learn about them. So to get a sense, and that comes later, there's an explanation, a little bit more extensive, just 3 or 4 verses that deal with them again. But just understand, it just helps the mind to think along those lines. To think that there's this stable mind that's ever present and it holds all the imprints. All right, now you can get to that. All right, so it makes sense. You can think about it. There's this really stable mind. And of course, the idea there are these imprints left. It almost seems like, if you're honest, like the way we think about it, it's like there's this mind, there's anger, and just before the anger is done, it throws a few imprints on the mind, and they're left on the mind. And then later on, there's something solid there. There are these imprints you carry to the next life, and then they pop up like mushrooms, in the form of different experiences. Of course, it's nothing like that. So solid and concrete the way. No, it's not like that. And that is explained here. Understand that this idea of this consciousness, well, it's not really like that. Now, what is important to understand, that with Chandrakirti's text, we learn something that's called the 8 difficult aspects of the Prasangika. There are 8 points the Prasangika makes. We learn those points, and they are unique to the Prasangika as part of the process of understanding emptiness. And one of those is understanding that there is no fundamental consciousness, no alavijnaya. That's one of those understandings, that there is no stable mind the way we may wish for it to be there, the stable mind that continues on holding all these imprints. Because really, if you have this stable mind, the Chittamatra school will talk about more than just 6 consciousnesses. They don't just talk about the 5 sense consciousnesses and the mental consciousness. They talk about this always present alavijnaya, this foundational consciousness, the purpose of which is mainly to hold the imprints. And then, of course, being the Chittamatra school, as we will learn more about them a little later, well, they say that phenomena only appear based on imprints arising in the mind. Now, it's really important to learn this school. It's really important. And I remember one of my teachers, he's an incredible Geshe. He once said, he taught us Prasangika, he taught us this text. And he said, when we learned this particular topic on the Chittamatra school, he said, you never move away from the view of the Chittamatra as much as you may expect. So we have a sense of, well, at some point we leave the Chittamatra behind and then we're back to Prasangika. But his view was that we believe the Chittamatra and the Prasangika are so different. They're actually not that different, because it's quite close. The importance of the mind in the Prasangika school and the Svatantrika school, that importance doesn't leave us. And although the way they describe external phenomena don't exist in that way, but this really prepares our mind to understand the Prasangika better. Okay, but as I just said, one of the aspects, one of the explanations we get as part of the, wait, let me just check my time to make sure I'm not, oh, I'm okay. One other aspect that we are taught when we study the entry into the middle way, when we study the Prasangika school, as part of these 8 points, there are 2 more points that are also part of this explanation here. And that's really difficult, which is that the 3 times are impermanent, past, present, and future are impermanent, and that the ceasing of something is also impermanent. That if, for instance, I engage in the action of killing, and once I've killed the person and I stop engaging the action of killing. Instead, I may have my breakfast or whatever. So that action of killing has ceased, but that's impermanent. First, you may go, yeah, all right, that's okay. But you see, we've studied the other schools extensively before we studied this text, and we were very familiar with the idea that the past and the future are permanent. In that, what do you mean? Yesterday's vase, is that impermanent? No, yesterday's vase is gone. It's just the negation, it's just the absence of something that was there before. So it's no longer existent. This is how the other schools think about it. They think of the 3 times as being permanent. No, sorry, the 2 times. The present is impermanent, obviously, like present table must be impermanent. It's a table. So let's talk about mind, body, all that is impermanent. But if you talk about the past table, well, that's no longer a table. So that's just the seizing, the seizing of the table. So that is permanent. It's just no longer any table. Or the future table hasn't yet arisen. So it's just a negation of it's there already. It hasn't arisen yet. That's it. There's nothing. It's like a non-affirming negative. It's just a negation of something. They must be permanent. The Prasangika school says, no, that's impossible because, and that also comes down to the fact that I engage in an act of killing and then that stops, that act stops. But that act of stopping, the act of stopping, it still creates, that stopping of the killing, that still creates an experience in the future. And if you take the Sutra of Dependent Arising, well, we learn that birth and aging are the causes of death. Well, death is the stoppage of something. What is death? Well, death is this process of like something ceasing, which means the connection between this body and my mind has stopped. That's death. It's when they separate. That's a ceasing, right? A cessation in that sense, a ceasing. So is that permanent or impermanent? Well, according to the Sutra of Dependent Arising, it's impermanent because it says very clearly, death is created by birth, aging, and sickness, right? In particular, as part of the 12 links, the former links create the later links. So birth, I should say, no. Birth is the cause of aging and death. Not birth and aging, sorry, it's birth is the cause. The link of birth is the cause of aging and death. So it's a cause of death. Death is a ceasing, and that is impermanent. This is how Lama Tsongkhapa, for instance, argues in his text, Illumination of the Intent, which is the commentary on the entry into the middle way, which you all have in the form of a draft. I believe it will be, the actual translation will be published on April 15th, I believe, 20th or 15th. Anyway, so then you can read the actual translation. This is just a draft. But in there, Lama Tsongkhapa is very clear. He says, well, death is definitely something impermanent. Now, therefore, the ceasing of my act of killing is impermanent. And it's because this act ceases, that cessation of that act of killing, that is really what is the connection between this life's killing and next life's being killed, for instance. Because that's this continuum. The act of killing, there's a continuum there, and that's just, the act of killing is no longer there. If the act of killing continued, it would be permanent. It would remain the same from moment to moment, but it can't. So I've killed someone, and we oftentimes think too much like there's this external killing and it's got nothing to do with the mind. But actually, of course, it's all mental. I mean, to become the act of killing, to become an act of murder, it all depends on the mind. The mind controls my actions of body and speech. So really, the main aspect is the mind. And the act of killing, well, that's actually, although it's a physical act, but it leaves something on the mind. It's the mind that directs it, and it's that mental process in particular. And so when it ceases, that mental process that caused me to kill, this ceasing of the killing, well, that continues on, and we just call that imprints. But really, that's what relate to it. So that's how we call it. But if you think about it, that's what we're saying. It's not some inherent concrete imprints that are left there. It's really just similar to when we say a seed has the potential to create a sprout. We're just labeling potential on the fact that later on a sprout arises. So there's not some kind of concrete potential, like in the form of a knedle or, in the form of something very solid. It's not found in that seed. We just name it that. And so similarly, an act of killing, when that act, in particular, if we think of it as like the mental process, when that act is over, it ceases, and that cessation, that ceasing, that continues on. And that's what we call the imprint, the residue that's left on the mind. That is impermanent, and it creates the experience in the future. That sounds like, what? That's like, what is that? Nothing solid. We were so happy with imprints and concrete and stuff. So it was like, wow, it all made sense. But now with the Prasangika, it's almost like they're pulling the floor underneath they're pulling the carpet underneath our feet, and we're like stumbling, like there's nothing solid any longer. How do you account for cause and effect? And this is exactly here the objection that's also presented here, saying, well, how do you account for cause and effect? You're saying that just ceasing and that's it. For the other schools, it's difficult anyway, because the ceasing of the killing, that's it, it's permanent. From then on, there's nothing, it's just gone, the act is gone. As I said early on, this is also really interesting and goes into areas like in the three times according to the Prasangika schools. Remember, I said there are 8 important points. I'm not addressing all of these points now. We'll get to them now. You can read them in Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary. He actually he mentions them in the beginning of this subject, but they don't mean something to you right away. But actually, he addresses 3 of them. One is that there's no fundamental consciousness, no Alavishnaya. And 2 is that past and future, the cessation, the seizing of something. Sorry, I should say that. The seizing of something is impermanent. And in fact, the 3 times are impermanent. So even the past is impermanent. The future is impermanent. And the present is impermanent. Now, if I ask you, for instance, and we have this debate a lot. In the debate, we would say, does Mao Zedong exist? And most people say no, he's past, he no longer exists. But actually, Mao Zedong exists, but he doesn't exist now. This is our sense. We take it from our perspective right now and then judge whether something is past, present, or future. But it's totally relative. It's in relation to someone who lived, who was a contemporary of Mao Zedong when he was still alive. From the perspective of that person, Mao Zedong is present. Mao Zedong lives at that moment. So it's similar to our sense of I. There's only one I, and that's me, because I only see it from my perspective. But of course, I is others for another person. So from my perspective, if we really check this sense of there's only one I, and that's me. There's only one self or I, that's I. On top of it, whatever this I thinks is beautiful, well, that is a good taste, right? You catch yourself thinking, oh, this is beautiful. This person has a good taste. Oh, they have a bad taste. What does that show us? This idea that there's really, and I get this all around me again and again. If my sister shows me something and I don't think it's nice, she gets offended because she thinks I believe she's got a bad taste, because there is a good and a bad taste. And it's basically what I have is the good taste. In general, we feel that way. That's what is a good taste. What I believe is right. And what another person, well, that's no, only if it's similar to what I think. It shows very much our sense of self-centeredness. So similar with regard to times, like, well, because if it doesn't exist now, from my perspective, it doesn't exist. Actually, strictly speaking, Mao Zedong exists, and the pyramids exist, and your Buddhahood exists. just not now. Not from your perspective right now, but in general, it exists. So to move away from that, it's just from my perspective, me here right now, all right, in general. But there's no contradiction to say that Mao Zedong exists and Mao Zedong is the present. Because if Mao Zedong exists, then there must be a present time when he exists. So Mao Zedong is the present. Okay, so we can talk of the past of Mao Zedong and the future of Mao Zedong, but Mao Zedong itself is the present. Now, this was just a very quick version of the 3 times, and I'm confusing you, I'm pretty sure. But if you think about it further, and we learn a lot about this, we spend a lot of time debating on that, and it makes more and more sense. So just to repeat that last bit, Mao Zedong, your Buddhahood exists, just not right now. Okay, your Buddha, you being a Buddha exist, and Mao Zedong and Itzhak Rabin exist, just not now. All right, Itzhak Rabin was in the past, well, your Buddhahood in the future, but in general, they exist. Is your Buddhahood past, present, or future? From your perspective right now, it lies in the future, but in general, it's present. For something to exist, it must exist at its own present time. So therefore, in general, your Buddhahood is the present, just not the present in terms of the present right now. All right. Therefore, we talk about past, present, and future. So your own Buddha, your being a Buddha, that's in the future, your future Buddha, from my perspective, your future. Well, that's impermanent because you're becoming that Buddha, and you're not becoming permanent suddenly. You're turning into an impermanent being who's a Buddha. And in that sense, it's not permanent as the other schools like to believe. Therefore, the 3 times are impermanent. Past, present, and future are impermanent. And they all exist. They may not exist right now, but in general, they exist. And connected to that, also the seizing of something now, it has a continuum. And so that seizing is impermanent. So the seizing of doing something is not permanent, but it's impermanent. All right. Now, this is important. And that also accounts for the fact that you don't need these imprints and what have you. It's just we call them imprints. We can still refer to them as imprints, but not as something solid and concrete as we may believe. We don't even need a solid and concrete basis. It's just saying that seizing of an action, all right, that leads to then experiencing something. And this is what it says in this verse. It's basically here, so verse 39, having experienced, 39. Oh yeah, there it is. Since actions do not cease in an intrinsic manner, they cease, but not in an intrinsic manner. They remain potent. So that ceasing of these actions, that continues on. That's just the continuum of that action. It's nothing solid. It's difficult to say what that is. It's not concretely laid out or set forth or explained in the Prasangika school, but that's possible even in the absence of a foundation consciousness, of that fundamental or foundation consciousness, as the translator calls it here, this Alavishnaya. Indeed, in some cases, the acts themselves may have long ceased, yet their effects will come about without fail. This you should know. So what does it mean here? They have long ceased, but that cessation is impermanent, so it can still have an effect. Therefore, all our actions of body, speech, and mind, they leave something behind on the mind, with the mind, and that's the seizing of these actions, but that holds a potential. And that potency, you may call it imprint or what have you, that potency, well, we call it a potential because it leads to a certain experience in the future. Getting killed ourselves. Now, this is really subtle, and we don't understand how each action holds this potential. It's extremely subtle. Only Buddha understands it. We can get some coarse understanding of that, but the subtle levels, and it'll tell us later, don't get into all these subtle levels. Just get a coarse understanding and act accordingly. But nothing has to exist inherently. It's because of causes and conditions. If causes and conditions come together, then this potency that was left on the mind that will ripen in the form of an experience. And in terms of the question this person asked about how can I have a certain emotional response, well, there may not have been an obvious trigger, but something may have subconsciously triggered that. There was maybe a music or whatever, something, some causes and conditions came together and they triggered that emotion that existed in the form of having ceased, and now it comes up again in an active form. So it was seizing it and now it comes up again. It was there in the form of a potency and now arrives again in the form of that seed. Sorry, in the form of that experience. And we need to understand that if it existed inherently, then it couldn't exist. All right. So if we can have verse 40, Eduardo, if we can have verse 40. Oh, yes. Thank you. So it goes on to say, so initially it's just saying, well, as I said just now, as I just explained, and it goes on to say then in verse 40, it gives an analogy of how that works. And this is a little difficult. It's actually taking a sutra as its basis. What it says here is having experienced certain things in a dream, a fool may continue to lust for them even when awake. Likewise, even from actions ceased and lacking intrinsic existence, effects will come to be. Now, this is based, actually, the self-commentary of Chandrakirti. He quotes the sutra. It's the sutra of transferring to another existence. It's actually talking about rebirth from one life to another. When you hear dream, the example of a dream, the analogy of a dream is oftentimes used for the dream of ignorance, being in that state of dream or sleep of ignorance, right? And dreaming. And then when you wake up, that's when you generate wisdom. That's not what's meant here. So don't hold on to this example meaning this. It actually means something slightly different. It's saying that we live our life like in a dream, and when we die, we wake up. That's the kind of analogy. So at the moment of death, that's when we awake. All right. So this is like a sense of, yeah, everything continues the way it did before. And then when do we wake? Well, when we die. That's meant with this here. But someone. So here the analogy is that, well, there's some people that if they dream, although, well, in the dream they have desire for other people, but then when they die, they don't realize. I mean, it was just a fantasy. So instead of becoming aware that things don't exist inherently and this was just a fantasy, they're what does he call them? Foolish person. So in Lama Tsongkhapa's text, or also in the self commentary by Chandrakirti. So in Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary, of course, on Chandrakirti's entry into the middle way, and in Chandrakirti's self commentary, well, they both talk about a foolish person, someone who hasn't realized how phenomena really exist. They hold on to this desire, although they had lust for a woman in their dream. Well, even at the moment of death, again, desire arises. So they may not, this is not saying they remember, but you do that woman, that's not literally what it's saying. That's what Lama Tsongkhapa also explains here, and the self-commentary explains. But it's more saying like, well, again, at the moment of death, again, there's desire. All right, we continue to live with desire, and then we're reborn. Okay, now, unfortunately, I wrote it all down here, the whole, like the whole sutra and everything, but it would take too long to go through it. It's all cited in here. It's just saying, having seen a beautiful woman in a dream, then even after waking up, that is when one is awake, the foolish person experiences intense lust, still continuing to focus on someone who has ceased. It's no longer there. So, but actually we should wake up at the moment of death and understand that our whole life is just driven by attachment, etc. But we don't. Even at the moment of death, there's again attachment. And due to that attachment, we are born again in another existence. And so really we're like this fool. So this is how it basically works, this analogy, how although we engage in all these actions and still we're not able to let go, it continues, this attachment continues on, then there's the seizing of all these actions, and in the next life we're again reborn. which means, in other words, so to put it into slightly, well, more extensive explanation, this also relates to a question that was asked: what is death and rebirth? What is rebirth at the time of conception, for instance? So what really happens? What happens is, because of our misapprehension of reality, that leads to extreme, exaggerated emotions. In other words, afflictive emotions. The most important of those is the self-cherishing attitude, the self-centeredness, and that leads to other extreme emotions, exaggerated emotions that don't perceive, that are not in accordance with reality: anger, attachment, and so forth. And all those, they lead to actions of body, speech, and mind that, even when they cease, they leave something behind. That cessation, that ceasing, that holds that potential for different experiences. So that's how we live our lives, and we create causes for future experiences. And then the karma that was responsible, these actions we accumulated that held us with this life, well, at some point that's exhausted. And when that is exhausted, that kept us together. That kept the body and the mind together. It kept our mental consciousness connected to this body. But when that karma is exhausted, that is the moment of death, instead of waking up and seeing, oh my gosh, we lived this life just driven by this attachment continues on. We hold on again. And that leads to the ripening of one of those cessations, or one of these karmas we've accumulated, that we're actually just a seizing of that particular action, and causes that force now causes this mind to connect to a fertilized egg in the case of human rebirth. So due to the karma, the karmic connection with other people and so forth, it's that force that kind of projects mental consciousness to a fertilized egg, if we take rebirth in that way. And so that then gives the basis, so that potency has ripened, and it gives rise to new actions, which again leave potencies, and so forth. So we continue on. Therefore, it's because attachment continues on, and likewise, these actions, the potencies we left, they're just the seizing of a certain action that's now no longer there, but it's the seizing of it, that's the kind of the potency, and that gives rise to all our experiences. And explained here based on this example of a person dying. That's the example, the analogy here. No, sorry, a person, the analogy, that the example is not the person dying. It's like in a dream, when you're in a dream and you wake up, and nonetheless you still hold on to the object of desire, although you should actually wake up and understand the person you dreamt of. If it was a beautiful woman or a handsome man, well, they didn't exist. They were just dreams. But holding on to it despite waking up, as like at the time of death, you should actually wake up, but we don't. We hold on to it, and we continue with that dream, basically holding on to the object of desire and dreaming a new dream. All right, that's what it says in verse 40. So it's similar to a dream. A fool continues with this lust, continues with the different afflictive emotions, and karma is continuously, even when an action ceases, not understanding that it lacks intrinsic existence, we continuously experience the effects of our action. So in other words, it's saying, as long as we don't understand reality, how phenomena really exist, the lack of inherent existence of actions, of our mind, of ourselves, and so forth, we continue to create these actions that, when they cease, they create new dreams, new dream states, where we experience suffering and unwanted experiences. And it works perfectly, even though things don't exist inherently. In fact, it only works because, since they don't exist inherently, they're dependent on causes and conditions. And if those come together, we have these experiences. All right. And then in verse, maybe do one more verse. Verse 41. So someone may object to that and say, well, if things don't exist inherently, if they don't exist in that way, if you just have that seizing of an action, and that creates lots of results. Well, it could just go on and endlessly create results. And we know that's not true, that the act of killing, for instance, as an example, I'll read it in a moment, but we know for a fact that every action leaves some potency, we call it imprint or what have you. It's really just the cessation, the seizing of that action, the stoppage of that action. And that stoppage, that holds in itself this potency, which gives rise to a certain experience, but not over and over and over again. Like one karma, maybe it's one action that holds the potential to be killed once or to be killed 3 times. And when that's over, well, that particular action or that potency can no longer create the result of being killed. But here someone argues, well, if it doesn't exist inherently, anything becomes possible. You could just be killed over and over again just due to one action. And no, that's not true. So here he gives an example. He says, just as something totally non-existent, so here non-existent, similar to not existing inherently. He kind of, although he's not saying that phenomena not existing inherently is the same as not existing at all. He's not saying that at all, but he's using this as an example. So something that doesn't exist. Okay, for instance, flying cows or this floating hair that appears to the mind, they don't exist at all, but they can still appear to the mind, and they don't necessarily all appear at the same time. Sometimes, due to causes and conditions, you have the appearance of floating hair. Sometimes, due to causes and conditions, you have the appearance of flying cows. And due to other causes and conditions, you have the appearance of horns that grow on a rabbit's head, what have you. But so, therefore, you have all these different forms that arise, even though they don't exist actually, but they can still appear to the mind in different ways. Similarly, although none of those actions exist inherently, nor does their ceasing exist inherently, nor does the continuum exist inherently, it exists but only conventionally, still it can give rise to all sorts of different experiences, and they're not always the same. It's not like you get killed again and again, because also the karma can be exhausted, although just conventionally. And so once it's exhausted, there's some cause missing for it to create again the experience of being killed. So just as these non-existent objects in the example, flying cows, just as they don't exist, karma doesn't exist inherently. It doesn't exist ultimately or independently. It doesn't exist independently. Now, not existing independently, it can still, in that dependent way, cause all sorts of different experiences. Similar to all these objects, although they don't exist at all, they can still appear to the mind, but they appear to the mind differently. When you have the experience of floaters, you don't have the experience of flying cows, for instance. They don't necessarily appear. So, likewise, there's still, on a conventional level, not every karma can create everything. Killing accords with being killed, for instance. And it's only in dependence on other things that is the case, and it still exists. In fact, it can only exist that way. Therefore, what it says here, while non-existent objects are equal in their unreality, so floating hairs, flying cows, they're equal, those with eye disease perceive floating hairs, not the form of just any other non-existent thing. They see floating hairs because of the causes and conditions. Know likewise that ripened acts do not bear fruit again. All right, so if something has ripened as a result of a certain action in the past, if a karmic result has ripened, and once it's ripened, it doesn't ripen again. It's still dependent on other causes and conditions, although just conventionally. And even though it doesn't exist the way it appears, it still works perfectly. Right? So here, the example, it's not that straightforward, but it's not meant to be that easy. We need to use our mind to understand this. So we need to really apply it So hopefully this has become clear. That should suffice for today. We've done 3 verses. I know they were not easy, but let's just go through it again as we usually do in our meditation, to just stress some of these points again and hopefully be able to internalize them. So we've covered 3 verses. I want to, well, we've gone not very fast recently, and we need to speed it up a little bit to be able to get through the text at some point. We've got time, but anyway, there's no harm in at some point getting through more. Okay, so great. Let's start with the breathing meditation first. So just let go of any disruptive thoughts, any distraction. Now, even if phenomena lack inherent existence, the law of karma still can function. In fact, it only functions if phenomena lack inherent existence. But since that's initially difficult to comprehend, the Buddha taught the Chittamatra school, which talks about a foundation consciousness that holds all the imprints of any action we've accumulated, all the imprints of those actions that haven't ripened yet. But that is just a device, or like training wheels, that temporarily help us to understand cause and effect. Since there is no foundation consciousness, that hold the imprints that are like concrete little balls, or in whichever other way we imagine them to exist. Instead, when we engage in an action such as stealing, for instance, the ceasing of that action, that ceased state, or that cessation, that is impermanent. When that cessation, due to other causes and conditions, ripens, we experience the result of having stolen. In the form of someone stealing our bag or breaking into our home. So it's the cessation of any action, body, speech, or mind, that we label karmic potency, karmic imprint. That cessation is impermanent. And together with the action itself, that cessation of the action is the cause, the karmic result. So for this, the Prasangika teaches us two of the 8 difficult points. That there's no foundation consciousness, and that the karmic action having ceased, having stopped, that is impermanent. It is a continuum. That remains with the person, with the mental consciousness, and ripens in the form of karmic experiences. Therefore, the cessation of our karmic action is the future continuum of that karmic action. While the past of that karmic action is the previous continuum. Which accounts for another difficult point of the Prasangika. That the past, present, and future of an impermanent phenomena are all impermanent. The past of today's I is yesterday's I. And its future is tomorrow's I. While the future I is also the cessation of today's I. The future Vas is the cessation of today's Vas. Similarly, the cessation of the karmic act of stealing is its later continuum. Which is impermanent and gives rise to the different karmic experiences. Hence, karma does not exist inherently, it's merely labeled. On the function of volitional actions and there later continue. And so now in conclusion, whatever feeling has arisen as a result of this short analysis, take a moment to focus on it single-pointedly, to allow for it to sink deeper into your own mind. And of course, let's now dedicate whatever virtue we've accumulated, in particular, trying to understand these really difficult points. May that cause us to eliminate all obstructions to the enlightened state of a Buddha, to actualize our fullest potential for the welfare of all sentient beings. But in the meantime, whatever merit we've accumulated, may it affect not just ourselves, but everyone else around us in a positive way. Make a difference to friends and family in our community. Especially those who are sick, like Tali Lubin, may they all get better soon. And may our study of Chandrakirti's text help people to be less lonely, less fearful. And of course, in the way Shantideva says, may all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. All right, thank you very much, and have a great week. And don't be discouraged. This is difficult about, we get a sense, well, get a sense karma, okay, that's how it works. And now we're told it's just that cessation of the having ceased and all that. It's difficult initially, but it's part of the process of learning about Prasangika. And that's why they're called the 8 difficult points. So they are difficult, so don't be discouraged. And we'll talk more about it next time. All right, great. Have a wonderful week.
Thank you.
And I'll see you again next Sunday. All right.
Geshe-la.
Thank you.
How wonderful,
Thank
Geshe-ma.
Thank you.
Thank
so
you.
much.
Bye.